In early 1973, the commander of an Airlines flight traveling from Newark, New Jersey to Miami was asked to check on a passenger in first class. The passenger in question was another alleged pilot from the company dressed in a complete captain's uniform. He didn't respond to the flight attendant's questions and was just staring straight ahead, as if he were inert, somewhat dazed. When the commander came to check what was happening and approached the passenger, he exclaimed, "My God, it's Bob Loft." It might have been a pleasant reunion between former colleagues of the company, but there was a small problem. Bob Loft had been dead for months. This story dates back to the tragic accident involving Airlines Flight 401 and the many spooky ghost sightings that were reported over time after the crash. On the night of December 29, 1972, the modern Lockheed L-1011, in operation for only 4 months by the airline Mr. Lines, fell victim to a tragic accident in the swampy waters of the Everglades region in Florida. The flight, coming from New York, was operating within normal operational standards until the crew began the descent procedure toward Miami. That's when the first act of a chain of events occurred that would ultimately lead to the loss of 101 lives out of the 176 aboard. It all began when the first officer, co-pilot Albert Stockstill, was instructed to lower the landing gear. Alarmingly, the crew noticed that one of the 3 green lights, indicating that the landing gear was down and locked, was not illuminated. Captain Robert, known as Bobby Loft, thought it's just a faulty bulb, so Stockstill began to remove it while the flight engineer, Donald Domrap, went to check through a periscope installed below the cockpit, designed precisely for this purpose, whether there was indeed a problem with the landing gear. It turns out that, while trying to troubleshoot the issue, according to articles about the case, the captain would have inadvertently disabled the autopilot as he stood up to also check the periscope, causing the plane to slowly lose altitude. When he returned to his seat, Loft noticed that his altimeter read 0 feet. In a conversation already filled with fear with his first officer, they were certain that something was very wrong, but by this point, there was nothing more to be done. The headlights of the L-1011 could be seen being reflected in the Everglades Lake by the forward sensors, and at 11:42 p.m., the plane crashed at about 400 kilometers per hour into the swampy waters of the lake, instantly disintegrating and killing 101 people. Many passengers died instantly, and those who survived faced an agonizing wait for rescue teams. The site was infested with crocodiles. First Officer Stockstill died upon the impact of the aircraft, but both Loft and Rapp initially survived. Rapp was rushed to the hospital after rescue, but ultimately succumbed to his injuries. Tragically, the rescue effort was also too slow for Captain Loft to have any chance, and he died at the scene. According to investigations, the cause of the accident was human error. The crew failed to verify the altitude of the aircraft while attempting to troubleshoot the landing gear problem. Ironically, it was discovered that the landing gear was locked in the correct position, and the issue was actually with the indicator lights on the panel. And what about the ghosts? With the plane completely destroyed in the crash, some parts were repaired with the intention of being reused in other planes of the same model. And that's where sinister things begin to happen. At least, that's when the explanation arises, right? Once, a flight attendant who was in the galley, that's the name of the place where flight attendants prepare meals and stuff, like a kitchen on the plane, you know? She was in the galley of a plane that had one of the pieces from Flight 401. She was there warming up meals for passengers when a mist started to form. She stopped what she was doing and looked curiously at the strange phenomenon. It was like a small cloud growing in the small space there by the stove. To her astonishment, an image formed by mist with Tom Hanks' face began to form in that spot. The flight attendant's name was Virginia. In desperation, she went up to the main cabin but chose not to tell her colleagues. She said she was feeling a bit unwell there, afraid of being dismissed for insanity. She simply kept that secret until another event occurred aboard the same plane. During the boarding procedure at Newark Airport, the lead flight attendant on a flight bound for Miami noticed the presence of a Mr. Captain sitting in first class and checking his list. She didn't find any crew members flying as extra passengers. Curious, she approached and asked the supposed captain some questions. He, with a strange expression on his face, stared straight ahead and didn't respond to the flight attendant's questions, who started to get irritated. Clearly, the situation began to attract the attention of other first-class passengers. Losing patience, the flight attendant went to the cockpit and called the flight captain to try to force the strange crew member to communicate and identify himself. After all, who was this guy? Upon reaching the seat, the flight captain recognized the silent supposed crew member. "My God, it's Bob Loft." Immediately afterward, in front of everyone, the silent figure mysteriously disappeared. As insane as it may sound, it ended up having repercussions. The flight had to be canceled. The attended passengers were already very frightened, and even the press began to suspect that something strange was happening on the plane. What's even more bizarre is that the events only escalated over time. The aircraft's logbook was starting to fill up with such notes. The captain, opting for silence, is seen by 3 crew members who cannot speak to him. He says nothing and suddenly disappears. A flight attendant opens the luggage compartment and finds Bobby Loft's face staring back at her from inside the compartment. The flight attendant faints. The co-pilot and flight engineer conduct an external inspection of the aircraft. After the pre-flight check, the co-pilot returns to his seat in the cockpit and finds a flight engineer sitting there, who says, "I've already done the pre-flight check, don't worry." The engineer was Donald Rich, who suddenly disappeared in front of the first officer. In addition to these, there are many other reports of appearances of both officers and passengers. Truly, a plethora of anomalies. To conclude, a sinister account. During a flight from Atlanta to Miami, aboard the same aircraft with the prefix N318EA, the cockpit crew was having their meal while cruising at 39,000 feet. Suddenly, they heard a loud bang coming from the hole where the periscope is located. I remember it was there that the recall was to observe if the landing gear was really having problems on Flight 401. By this point, ghost stories were already circulating within the company. The crew hesitated to look to see what it was, but the banging continued. When the flight engineer opened the hatch, he was horrified to see Rich's face staring back at him horribly. The engineer was on board when Flight 401 crashed. As sightings became increasingly frequent, rumors circulated that pilots and crew refused to fly on the L-1011 that had parts from the condemned jet installed. Paranormal investigators repeatedly requested permission to board and see if they could see anything or make contact with the supposed crew ghosts, but the airline continuously refused. However, all the recovered pieces from Flight 401 were later removed from the suspected jet. That story, how? It's better to be safe than sorry, even if it's not admitted. And although the company ignored certain reports about crew sightings and other supernatural events, the legend of Flight 401 lives on. What to believe? Well, that's up to each individual.